Good evening, everyone. My name is David Harding, and I'm going to be presenting today on international terrorism and the policy and practice of the strategies that were developed to fight against it. With that being said, I'll just go ahead and get started with the introduction. In the aftermath of 9/11, there were a comprehensive set of policies which were developed to combat international terrorism. These all focused ultimately on deterring terrorist attacks within the United States. And post 9/11, there was a full spectrum counterterrorism policy which was put into effect, falling under the general header of what came to be called the Global War on Terror. Abroad, this strategy encompassed a policy of preemptive war to topple regimes friendly to terrorist groups. And domestically, the effort to combat terrorism resulted in increased surveillance and police powers. It would be fair to say that there wasn't one single policy that was put into place, but rather a collection of policies. But in general, these were all focused on a sort of forward-looking, proactive, military and intelligence-led strategy of counterterrorism. With regards to my methodology, I evaluated several texts and several wide spectrum of texts, and from congressional records, scholarly journals, think tank white papers and reports, and other authoritative texts. I tried as best as possible to evaluate each on their own merits, sort of taking them each as singular documents, because obviously they are, and just sort of come to sort of synthesis of the cited material. So getting right down into it, what is counterterrorism policy? Like it sounds, it's policies which are put forward to counter, fight, or combat against terrorism. Most countries, or at least countries that suffer from terrorist attacks, have some form of counterterrorism policy, and this varies from country to country depending on the type of problems they're facing with regards to terrorism, the nature of the group that they're fighting against, and what their ultimate aims are. So in the US's case, obviously one of government's core responsibilities is to protect the nation and its citizens. War powers are expressly enumerated in the Constitution. After 9/11, Congress held hearings to determine how exactly the attacks took place and how they were missed, or what could have been done to prevent that specific attack, and what could be done to prevent future attacks. The result of that was the 9/11 Commission report, which made several findings and several recommendations. Two of the findings were that there had been mismanagement at the CIA and at the FBI in terms of failures to communicate with one another. Second finding was that there were low levels of cooperation between the military and civilian first responders. With regards to recommendations, it recommended that there be closer integration between intelligence gathering agencies and federal law enforcement, so between like the CIA and the FBI. It also recommended that there be created a new department specifically for defense of the nation. That resulted in the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And lastly, that there be a new cabinet level position to oversee the nation's intelligence agencies. It's sort of weird to think about, or I guess if you don't really know too much about the subject, but there are, I believe, 17 intelligence agencies. So just about every single department in the federal government has some sort of intelligence gathering agency. So Treasury has its own intelligence gathering agency. Same thing with the FBI. CIA is obviously its own intelligence gathering agency. So what were the strategic objectives? So policymakers in the George W. Bush administration had the explicit goal of preventing another 9/11, an attack on American soil, particularly of the size and scope of 9/11. Counterterrorism policies were developed and promulgated at the federal level of government, and involved stakeholders primarily from the military and intelligence communities. Of course, elected officials like the president and members of Congress also played a role in shaping policy. However, the bulk of policy emanated from the executive branch through explicit legislation and executive orders. The Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, CIA, and NSA took leading roles. Obviously, as the problem of international terrorism suggests, it's an international problem. So the United States also partnered with other countries in attempting to strengthen or create new agreements to combat international terrorism. A lot of these groups aren't necessarily based just in one country, or if they are, if they border another country, say like with the example of Pakistan and Afghanistan, they pretty easily flow across the border. So the United States felt that it was in its best interest to partner with these countries to make fighting these groups more effective. Some of these partners include the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. So what did the policy look like in practice? In terms of policy implementation, the strategy largely was executed by the federal departments and bureaucracies tied to defense and intelligence. The role played by state and local governments was, for the most part, minimal in terms of like active campaigns. The federal government does make block grants available to state and local governments. So if you live in a city or you live in a state that has a large enough police department, they can make use of federal grants to purchase equipment, purchase access to federal databases in order to keep track of or keep tabs on suspected terrorists or individuals that might become radicalized at some point in the future. Further policy also included a sort of refocusing of the mission of NATO. NATO was originally constituted to defeat, or I guess fight against, the Soviet Union in the 40s and 50s. After 9/11, the article which, I think I misspelled it here actually, I said Article 4, it's actually Article 5, was the, or is the mutual defense triggering mechanism for NATO to come into, for NATO members to come into aid of each other. The US triggered that article after 9/11, and NATO members went on to fight in Afghanistan. With regards to the foreign side of the counterterrorism policy, this included the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, 2003 invasion of Iraq, and then three main sort of policies that were put into place. These were enhanced interrogation, targeted killing, and extraordinary rendition, which I went into some detail in the previous presentation. Domestically, what happened was the increase of surveillance powers, amendments to the FISA acts. That's basically, I don't want to call it a secret court, but I mean, it's almost basically a secret court where federal law enforcement officials can go obtain warrants to survey individuals' homes, sometimes, or actually I should say all the time, without no, I'm sorry, they are able to obtain a warrant, but the nature of the warrant is kept secret. So you wouldn't be able to go into a specific agency like the FBI, file a FOIA request and find out exactly why someone was searched. In terms of the policy costs, with enhanced interrogation, targeted killing, and extraordinary rendition, these were all tremendously controversial when they were first made public. Enhanced interrogation was likened to torture, which is illegal in this country, illegal internationally in most other countries. Targeted killings aren't illegal, so to say. They sort of occupy a gray area in terms of international war powers. extraordinary rendition, that was the act of the U.S. Capturing terrorists or suspected terrorists or illegal combatants overseas, and then rendering them to third-party countries in order to practice enhanced interrogation. In terms of the global war on the cost of the global war on terror, to date, $5.6 trillion have been spent in direct spending, and $1.5 trillion of that by just the Department of Defense. Just with the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, 4,400 U.S. servicemen have been killed, 32,000 injured, and 2,400 servicemen in Afghanistan killed and 20,000 injured. So I guess with all that said, like, what are the conclusions? The results of the global war on terror and the strategy which relied on the military and intelligence agencies are sort of greatly disputed. You won't find too many policy papers which argue for the success of the U.S. in either Iraq or Afghanistan. We left Iraq in 2011. We're still fighting, although not as we don't have as large a footprint in Afghanistan as we did initially, but we're still fighting there. And although there hasn't been a terrorist attack on the scale of 9/11 since 9/11, obviously, there have been several smaller attacks here in California, in North Carolina, South Carolina, and it sort of begs the question, we're spending all this money and we don't know exactly what we're getting for it. Other costs involve sort of like damage to our national prestige when the revelations about enhanced interrogation were revealed. And then there was also the issue of war crimes. Several members of the George Bush administration, I mean, none of them have been prosecuted, obviously, but several members of them have had to watch where they travel when they're traveling internationally. Some countries have threatened to arrest and prosecute them. And I guess the last conclusion would just sort of focus on what law enforcement remedies exist. These have largely been ignored in terms of counterterrorism policy here in the United States. I don't think that they should have been. The U.S. court system, U.S. Law enforcement is more than capable of prosecuting terrorists, investigating terrorists. When you get right down to it, although they commit large-scale acts of political violence, most of what they're engaged in is criminal activity. That's how they fund themselves. Many terrorist groups are involved in the drug trade, human trafficking, and there isn't really any reason, absent sort of, I guess what you'd call, or what can be referred to as sort of the rhetoric of like public fear, why you need to spend as much money and lives in combating terrorism when you have an alternate system, the court system and the law enforcement system that's already there and previous to 9/11 had, I wouldn't say taken care of, but had handled the majority of terrorism cases, and still does to a large degree. Even after 9/11, several terrorists who were caught overseas were prosecuted in federal courts and sent to prison. So with that being said, that's the end of the presentation, and I'll go on to the questions that I was asked. The first one is from Tim, which asks, how does the federal government work with state and local governments to prevent terrorism? This is largely in two ways. I mentioned the federal grants which are on offer to state and local governments. For the most part, these are used to facilitate sort of, I don't want to say conversations, but I guess you can't refer to it as conversations, but just sort of making sure that there's an open link to the federal government and to the state and local government, so that information from the top about maybe possible specific events will be communicated down to state and local governments, and if state and local governments pick up on something, that gets relayed back up to the federal government. The second way that the federal government and state and local governments cooperate is in what is it called? I just lost my train of thought. It's in local law enforcement, sort of, I don't want to say keeping an eye on, but being aware of the communities that they're policing, the nature of the communities that they're policing, individuals in those communities who might pose a risk to public safety, and then alerting the federal government or state government, depending on what the situation might be. The second question was from Cynthia, and this asked, how can the government interrogate terrorists while maintaining legal and ethical standards? Actually, I don't think this is as hard an answer, or the answer shouldn't be as hard as one might think. The U.S. Civilian court system has had to deal with terrorist groups in the past, even when you think of the KKK or the Black Panther Party. Other terrorist groups that have existed in the United States have had to deal, or I should say, law enforcement has had to deal with terrorist groups in the past. The new, I guess, breed of terrorist isn't exactly that new. Most of the tactics that they utilize are tactics that have been used for decades, and there isn't really any reason why law enforcement can't handle at least the investigatory and prosecution of terrorist suspects. The third question is from Manuel. What are the unintended consequences of the policy domestically and internationally? I would say that domestically, at least, the consequences of a lot of these policies was severalfold. A lot of it resulted in, number one, a lot of money being spent in deploying troops overseas, mainly in deploying troops overseas and in the wars. And when you think about it, Afghanistan has lasted almost 20 years. Iraq lasted for about 8 or 9 years. Then you have all the costs that are associated with that. You've had veterans coming back. The VA has to take care of those people. Some of the other consequences have been to what most people would call our civil liberties. It's become a lot easier in the years after 9/11 for governments to charge people with terrorism charges, even when what they were doing might still be a crime, but isn't necessarily terrorism. It's become easier for the government to survey people. And I don't know that that was what many people had in mind when Congress first gave the government those powers. So in the last question is from Professor Collins. It asks, what is the best method to deal with terrorist threats? Covert undercover operations or specific military operations? I don't think that either one should be totally ruled out. I mean, I said earlier that law enforcement is more than capable of dealing with the majority of the domestic terrorist threats, and those from overseas, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for the military and intelligence services to play. I think that if done smartly, the two can work in concert. I don't think that the emphasis that was put on military and intelligence gathering should have been as high as it was. More effort, more emphasis should have been put into law enforcement strategies for counterterrorism. All right, with that, that comes to the end of the terrorism. Thank you all for watching. And the last question is from Professor